Welcome everyone, this is Manisha. We are taking another chapter of Class 12 Political Science, which is Environment and Natural Resources. Let's take the overview first. In this chapter, we are going to study some important environmental movements against the backdrop of rising profile of environmentalism from 1916 onwards. The stand taken by India as more recent environmental debates. Next follows a brief account of the geopolitics of resources competition, the indigenous people's voices, and concerns from the margins of contemporary world politics. Let's start this chapter with a very first heading, which is environmental concerns in global politics. Most of them are such that no single government can address them fully. Therefore, they have to become part of world politics. Issues of environment and natural resources are political in another deeper sense. Although environmental concerns have a long history, awareness of the environmental consequences of economic growth acquired an increasingly political character from the 1916 onwards. The Club of Rome, a global think tank, published a book in 1972 entitled Limits to Growth, dramatizing the potential depletions of Earth resources against backdrop of rapidly growing world population. International agencies, including the United Nations Environmental Programme (UNEP), begin holding international conferences and promoting detailed studies to get a more coordinated and effective response to environmental problems. Since then, the environmental has emerged as a significant issue of global politics. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in June 1992. This was called the Earth Summit. The summit was attended by 170 states, thousands of NGOs, and many multinational corporations. The 1987 Brundtland Report was our common future had warned that traditional pattern of economic growth were not sustainable in the long term. In Rio summit was the rich and developed countries of first world, generally referred to the global north, were pursuing a different environmental agenda that the poor and developing countries of the third world called the global south. The northern states were concerned with ozone depletion and global warming, and southern states were anxious to address the relationship between environmental management. Rio Summit produces conventions dealing with climate change, biodiversity, forestry, and recommended a list of development practice called Agenda 21. There was a consensus on combining economic growth and ecological responsibility. This approach to development is commonly known as sustainable development. Let's start another topic, which is the protection of global commons. Commons are those resources which are not owned by anyone but rather shared by a community. Some areas or regions of the world which are located outside the sovereignty jurisdiction of any one state and therefore requires a common governance by the international community. They are known as res communis humanities or global commons. They include the Earth's atmosphere, Antarctica, the ocean floors, the outer space. There have been many path-breaking programs and agreements such as the 1959 Antarctica Treaty, 1987 Montreal Treaty, and 1991 Antarctica Environmental Protocol. The discovery of ozone hole was over the Antarctica in the mid-1980s revealed the opportunity as well as dangers inherent in taking global environmental problems. Another topic is global but differentiated responsibilities. The developing countries or the South feels that much of the ecological degradation in the world is the product of industrial development undertaken by developed countries. The developing countries areas in the process of industrialization and they must not be subjected to the same restrictions which apply to the developed countries. The special needs of the developing countries must be taken into account in the development applications and interpretation of rules of national environmental laws. This argument was accepted in Rio Declaration of Earth Summit in the 1990 and is called the principle of common but differentiate responsibilities. The relevant part of the Rio Declaration says that states shall cooperate in the spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect, and restore to health and integrity of the Earth ecosystem. States have common but differentiate responsibilities. The 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was known as UNFCCC, also provides the parties should act to protect to climate system on the basis of equity and accordance with their common but differentiate responsibilities and respective capabilities. Largest share of historical and current global emission of greenhouse gases has originated in developed countries. It was also acknowledged that per capita emission in developing countries are still relatively low. The Kyoto Protocol is an international agreement setting targets for industrialized countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. Certain gases like CO2, methane, hydrofluorocarbon, etc., are considered at least partially responsible for global warming. The protocol was agreed to in 1997 in Kyoto in Japan, was based on principles set out in UNFCCC. Let's start on the topic which is common property resources. Common property represent common property for the groups. The underlying norms here is that members of groups have both rights and duties with respect to the nature, level of us, and the maintenance of the resources. A combination of factors including privatization, agriculture, intensification, population growth, and ecosystem degradation have caused common property to dwindle in size, quality, availability to the poor in such of world. Let's start and another topic which is India's stand on environmental issues. India signed and ratified the 1997 Kyoto Protocol in August 2002. India and China and other developing countries were exempted from the requirement of Kyoto Protocol because their contribution to the emission of greenhouse gases during the industrialization period. However, the critics of the Kyoto Protocol point and the sooner or later India and China along with other developing countries will be amongst the leading contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. At the G8 meeting in June 2005, India pointed out that per capita emission rates of the developing countries are a tiny fractions of those in the developed worlds, following the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Very first, India's international negotiation positions relies heavily on principle of historical responsibility on enshrined in UNFCCC. This acknowledges the developed countries are responsible for most historical and current greenhouse gas emissions and emphasize that economic and social development as the first and overriding priority of the developing parties. India's government is already participating in global efforts through a number of programs. For example, India's national auto fuel policy mandates cleaner fuels for vehicles. The Energy Conservation Act passed in 2001 the outlines initiatives to improve energy efficiency. Similarly, the Electricity Act of 2003 encourages the use of renewable energy. The government is also keen to launch a national missions on biodiesel, using about 11 million hectares of land to produce biodiesel by 2011 and 12. And India has one of the largest renewable energy programs in the world. A review of the implementation of the agreement of the Earth Summit in Rio was undertaken by India in 1997. India finds it necessary that developed countries take immediate measures to provide developing countries with financial resources and clean technologies to enable them to meet their existing commitments under UNFCCC. India is also on the view that the SARS countries should adopt a common position on major global environment issues so that the region's voice carries greater weight. Let's start on the topic which is environmental movements, one of many. The environmental movements are amongst the most vibrant, diverse, and powerful social movements across the global today. It is within social movements that new forms of political actions are born or reinvented. The very first is the forest movements of Brazil, South in Mexico, Chile, Malaysia, Indonesia, continental Africa, and India are faced with enormous pressure. Second, forest clearing in the third world continues at an alarming rate despite 3 decades of environmental activism. The mineral industry is one of the most powerful form of industry on the planet. A large number of economies on the south are now being reopened to MNCs through the liberalizations of the global economy. Displacement of communities amongst the factors continue to invite criticism and resistance in various parts of the globe. In every country where a mega dams movements for more sustainable and equitable management of rivers movements are pro-river movements for more management of river systems and valleys. The early 1980s saw the first anti-dam movement launched in the north, namely a campaign to save the Franklin River and its surrounding forest in Australia. Let's start another topic, which is resources geopolitics. Resources geopolitics is all about who gets what, when, where, and how. Resources have provide some of the key means and motives of global environmental and European powers expansions. The global economy relieves an oil for such of the 20th century of a portable and indispensable fuel. Saudi Arabia has a quarter of world's total reserves and is the single largest product users. Iraq's known reserves are second only to Saudi Arabia. Water is another crucial resource that is relevant to global politics, regional variations, and the increasing scarcity of fresh water in some parts of the world points to the possibility of disagreement over shared water resources as the leading sources of conflicts in the 21st century. A number of studies show that countries that share rivers, and many countries do share rivers, are involved in military conflicts with each other. The another topic is the indigenous peoples and their rights. The question of indigenous peoples brings the issues of environment, resources, and political together. Indigenous peoples today live more in conformity with their with particular social and economic and cultural customers and customs and traditions that the institutions of country of which they now form a part. The indigenous voice in world politics for the admission of indigenous people to the world community as equal. Indigenous peoples occupy areas in control in South America, Africa, India, and South Asia. The appeal to government to come to terms with continuing existence of indigenous peoples all over the world, to refer to their continued occupants of the land from which they originate. In India, in in India, most indigenous peoples in India depends for their subsistence primarily on the cultivation of lands, although that they enjoy a constitutional protections in political representation, they have not got much of the benefits of development in the country. Issues related to the rights of indigenous commissions have been neglected in domestic and international politics for very long. During the 1970s, growing international contacts among indigenous leaders from around the world aroused a sense of common concerns and shared experiences. The World Council of Indigenous Peoples was formed in 1975. The council became consequently the first of 11 indigenous NGOs to receive consultative status in the UN, many of the movements against globalization. With this, we have come to an end of this chapter. I hope you found this video informative. Till then, catch you guys in the next video. Thank you.